So I got one question from you guys for Stump the Pastor. So I'm going to leave the basket back there, just collect them throughout the year. So as they pop up in your mind, you can write them down. So if you don't mind, then what I'll do is I'll just answer the ones that were asked at Heritage also. But I will start with the one that was asked here. Why is it that in the Apostles' Creed we continue to use the phrase the Holy Catholic Church when some denominations have changed it to the Holy Universal Church? It seems to me that it might be confusing to someone hearing it for the first time or a person who is not a regular attendee. And I think that's a good question. Because if you're new to church, it sounds like you switched denominations all of a sudden. Right smack dab in the middle of a sentence. And historically, the word Catholic doesn't mean Roman Catholic. It means universal, the whole church across time and space. So when we say it, we're saying the church is bigger than ourselves, just our little congregation, bigger than our tribe, bigger than our favorite label. That said, if a word has become more confusing than helpful, the church should not act like explaining it badly as a spiritual gift. So I understand why some congregations say universal church. It's just translation, right? Personally, I'm fine with either as long as we understand what we're confessing, that we belong to something bigger than ourselves. And part of me, when I read that question, was also like, it's interesting that we ask questions about changing these words, but when we try to change other words that are traditionally associated with prayers and theologies within the church, we clench right up. So it's kind of an interesting thing where we draw the boundaries to me. So that's it. Okay, we're done. So I'm just going to go into some of the ones, and I'm going to keep an eye on the clock so I don't go too long. Okay. First one is, why are humans so set in their ways? Anything. Best verse in the Bible to address it. And my best answer to that, I should also throw this out here. This is my caveat that I forgot to give right at the beginning. These are my answers, okay? You take them with a grain of salt, or take them to the woodshed if you like. Doesn't matter. This is just my answer. It doesn't mean that it's the right answer. I think it is, but I'm just kidding. So I think humans are so set in their ways is because we love our habits and our rhythms and our patterns, even if they're bad. Because we would rather live in something that is familiar and predictable, even if it's misery, than anything that an unpredictable or unfamiliar freedom might have for us. And we do it psychologically, we do it socially, we do it spiritually. We get attached to what is known, even when what is known is hurting us. And if they ask for a verse too, the best verse in the Bible to address, and I couldn't come up with just one, because one of them that I might point to would be Jeremiah, chapter 13:23, which interestingly is the source of a very famous old saying. Can Ethiopians change their skin, or leopards their spots? So that's where we get, can a leopard change their spots? Then also, you can do good who are accustomed to doing evil, which is a harsh way of saying it, but it does name how our habits can sink so deeply into us that it just feels natural. And then a New Testament verse I might throw at it would be Matthew 9:17. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins, which seems to talk about real change is not really just about trying harder. That old forms cannot fit into, or new life cannot fit into old forms. So sometimes what God is doing in us will not fit inside the structures and the assumptions and the habits and the rhythms and the patterns we've gotten used to. In the early books of the Bible, God appears to be very specific about how the Jews are to construct things and the procedures they are to follow. And he appears to be very picky about it. It's not an appearance, he is in those sections. My question is God really interested in all that minutia? And my response is, I do not think that God is obsessed with cubits. Kind of like in some ways that the people around us are obsessed with kitchen renovations. But when you're a people who are learning to worship, and when you're learning what that means and what justice might mean and what identity is and how holiness take concrete shape, then I think you need that kind of stuff. The details matter not because God is petty about it, but because embodied life matters. Space matters. And if you don't think that line's true, if I told you we're going to have worship down in the basement from now on, I'd have to start dodging tomatoes before too long. Or whatever, modern equivalent would be. Wow, I'm old. She just shrugged. What can you do? But it's not only space that matters, it's practice, it's ritual. And the danger becomes when we mistake form for the actual point. So yes, I do think that God cares that faith takes shape in the real world. No, I don't think God is up in heaven with the clipboard saying, that curtain ring is off by 3 inches and now I am furious. And if I may take one pastoral moment here, because I have noticed in this area and in conversations with y'all and with conversations with people at Heritage, that we don't seem to have a lot of practices that we hold with any kind of deep meaning. The order of worship changes because the pastor changes it. Not because it means very much to us in itself. Christmas and Easter don't gather or don't seem to get more people, and we don't seem to react to it differently. And even outside church life, there are not many common times or seasons that we mark together in a way that really shapes us. And I think that's worth paying attention to. Because if practice and ritual and holiness matter, and we don't have many shared practices that feel meaningful to us, then maybe that tells a little bit of the truth of who we are. Maybe we've learned how to continue church without deeply inhabiting it. Maybe we've inherited forms without a strong sense of why they matter. And maybe the work before us is not to become more elaborate, but to be more intentional. To let worship take enough of a shape that it can actually form us into a people. Because the danger is that a church that doesn't know how to mark what matters will eventually stop knowing what matters at all. End of pastoral rant. And as usual, I always get like at least 3 questions that deal with heaven. Is heaven real or just a state of mind? If it is real, is it different for everyone? And I will give you my standard answer to all heaven-related questions from the beginning and then go from there. I have absolutely no idea what heaven will be like. I know what I hope it will be like. But the truth is, no one on this side of death knows for sure. And if they say they do, they're doing one of 3 things. They're revealing a very deep hope that's inside them. They're pushing a theological agenda, or they're selling something. So when people ask, is heaven is real? My answer is, maybe. In some sense, maybe it's far deeper and stranger than most of our pictures of it are, right? I am open to life with God beyond death. I just don't pretend to know the mechanics of it. Scripture, when it talks about it, gives us promise, it gives us poetry, it gives us person way more than it gives us, floor plans or whatever. As for whether it's different for everyone, again, don't know. And honestly, I am here in this world right now. And that's enough for me to think about. I'm not faithful to God or a follower of Christ because I want to save my own skin from hell or secure a better address in the afterlife. If there's a heaven, fantastic. If there's not, and the only thing that I have ever done with my life is make this world a little bit better of a place than it was before I got here, I'd call that a life well lived and worth everything, the blessings and the curses that came with it. So no, I cannot give you a brochure, but I can tell you this: I trust the God revealed in Jesus Christ more than I trust my own ability to picture the afterlife. Which leads to heaven question number 2. If people in heaven are perfectly joyful, will they remember loved ones that didn't make it there? And part of what really sets me off about that phrase, the phrasing of that question, is the line, loved ones who didn't make it there. Because it really can smuggle in this kind of idea that faith is about saving my own skin again. And I'm hoping that I picked the right side of the fence. And that has never felt like the heart of the gospel to me. But underneath that is a very human ache, I think. As if to ask the question, can God be trusted not to make joy depend on amnesia? And my answer is no. I do not think eternity with God depends on forgetting the people we love. I do not believe God heals us by making us less loving, less truthful, or less ourselves. I do not think perfect joy means moral numbness. But I also do not know exactly how all that is held in the life of God. This is one of those places where certainty gets cheap very quickly. What I can say is that I trust God more than I trust my ability to solve how all of it possibly works. And then heaven question number 3. If Jesus says there's no marriage in heaven, will married couples still be married there, or will they just be really good friends? When Jesus talks about that in the Gospels, I don't think he's saying that love gets erased. I think he's saying that marriage is this social and earthly structure belongs to this life and this world, and not necessarily to what comes after. So if you're asking, will the people I love still matter to me? I cannot imagine the answer is no. But if you're asking me to describe exactly how relationships work after death, I have no idea, and neither does anybody else. Nor do I trust anyone who claims to. So I'm going to answer one that Dawn asks. She gets to hear it twice, but she's here too. So of course she dropped this on me last week. So what scripture do you still struggle with and why? And the scriptures that I struggle with most are the ones about the very violent texts. The ones where violence is attributed to God or said that God commanded it. Because those still bother me bad. And I've tried to live with them through this kind of an idea that human beings throughout history, we have always been developmental creatures. We still are. We have our developmental life stages we've developed over the centuries and millennia. So, and I also say that God meets people where they are. But I also have to recognize that people hear God through the limits of their own time and their own culture and their own moral development. So I do not assume every violent attribution reveals God's heart clearly. Some of those texts may tell us not only about God's engagement with Israel, but also how a violent people in a violent age understood that engagement. And I don't think the Bible's hardest texts are there because God loves violence. I think they're there because God has always been dealing with real people in real history, and real people are very often brutal, tribal, frightened, and convinced that God agrees with them. Which is not saying God could only speak to them in violent terms. What it's more saying is that they could only hear God in violent terms. So that's one reason I read those passages under the light of Jesus, who shows me a God who would rather bear violence than sanctify it. Still struggle with them, though. And I would give the related one as my last one. Maybe I shouldn't. I get in trouble. All right, then I'm doing two more so I don't end on that note. So this question was, what is your least favorite verse in the Bible and why? And this one's going to ruffle some feathers, I know. My least favorite verse in the Bible is John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Not because I dislike John's gospel, but because this verse gets used very much like a blunt object. It becomes a way of sorting people out by location of belief and, by extension, a presumed eternal destination, instead of being heard in the context that John is actually giving it. Because in the Gospel of John, over and over and over again, John is not just offering Jesus as some kind of slogan about who is in and who's out. He starts the book as he is the Word made flesh. The living embodiment of God's teaching, of God's guidance, and God's life among us. John keeps building that picture throughout the whole gospel. If you can look it up on Google, just look up the I am sayings in the Gospel of John. I am the bread. I am the light. I am the door. I am the shepherd. I am the vine. So when Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, I don't hear him saying, here's the password. I hear him saying, in me, the very life and instruction of God has taken flesh. Because the way is a reference to Torah. The truth is a reference to Torah, which means teaching, by the way, not law, teaching or instruction. And life is a reference to Torah. And if you would like my full paper on this, I'll be glad to print it out for you. But that's why it troubles me so much when John 14:6 gets reduced to this boundary marker for deciding who is acceptable to God. And it's my least favorite verse, not because of what it says in John, but because of how it has been ripped out of John and used to shrink the gospel to a sorting mechanism. And because I will not end on that, I'll go to this one. What belief held by modern Christians would surprise the earliest Christians the most? And I've been struggling with two parts to this. The first is, I think that the earliest Christians would be shocked, first and foremost, by how thoroughly non-Jewish we are. Jesus was a Jew. The disciples were Jews. Paul was a Jew. The earliest church was deeply Jewish. And in fact, that's why Paul is writing them. They're trying to figure out how to reconcile the Jews with the non-Jews who have found Christ. And it took 900 years for Christianity to become fully separated from Judaism. And the second part of it, because that one's not so much a belief but it kind of is. You know what I'm saying? Anyway. I think they'd be surprised at how quickly we modern Christians move past the mystery of Jesus and into doctrinal formulas, as though the church has always talked that way. The early church was constantly working with local translations of the gospel. In effect, what does Jesus mean for us here in this place among these people? Which is funny because that is also how early Methodism worked in America. Because you didn't have a pastor coming in every week to give you a sermon. You had him once a month, if you're lucky, which is why we have communion once a month. So these circuit riders left the telling of the gospel and the sharing of the gospel and the living of the gospel to the people in their places. So that's a lot of theological work happening locally through a lived practice. Because you all, if you were there, would have had to ask yourself what faith looked like here and now, and not just try to repeat a finished formula that somebody else had done. Which you probably wouldn't have heard about anyway. Because it's not like word traveled fast back then. So my answer would be the idea that Christian is naturally non-Jewish, and the assumption that our later doctrinal language arrived fully formed from heaven. And a close runner-up would be how individualistic we've made our faith. As though Christianity were mainly about my personal beliefs and where I go when I die, rather than a people, a kingdom, and a way of living in the world together. All right, that's long enough.